President Trump traveled to Kenosha, Wisconsin today, even though the state's governor asked him not to visit. It's been the site of recent protests over police brutality and racial injustice. Flanked by Attorney General William Barr and Acting Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf, the president toured properties damaged during the demonstrations. While there, he said the city would heal quickly and praised law enforcement.
To stop the political violence, we must also confront the radical ideology that includes this violence. Reckless, far-left politicians continue to push the destructive message that our nation and our law enforcement are oppressive or racist. They'll throw out any word that comes to them. Actually, we must give far greater support to our law enforcement. It's all about giving them additional support. These are great people. These are great people. These are brave people. They're fighting to save people that they never met before in many cases, and they're incredible. We must really be thankful that we have them, and we have to help them do their jobs. We can't be threatening them with their pensions are going to be taken away, their jobs going to be taken away, everything's going to be taken away. They're going to be living a bad life if they utter an incorrect word. You can't do it.
Mr. Trump did not meet with the family of Jacob Blake Jr., the black man shot 7 times in the back by a Kenosha police officer. However, while President Trump was there, Blake's family and local organizers led a peaceful community event at the site of the shooting. For more, let's bring in Ed O'Keefe and Gabby Orr. Ed is a CBS News political correspondent, and Gabby is a White House reporter for Politico. Thank you both for joining us. Gabby, we know the pastor of Jacob Blake Jr.'s mother met with the president today, but what do we know about the president's attempts to get in contact with Blake's family?
Well, the president told reporters at the White House yesterday that he had made overtures to the Blake family, that he had wanted to speak with them at some point during his visit, but that they, according to him, had wanted to get lawyers involved, and President Trump did not feel that that was appropriate. And so he instead, during his visit to Kenosha today, met with law enforcement officials, with local business owners, but he did not meet with members of the Blake family. The interactions between the president and relatives of the Blake family or those close to them has been limited to him and the pastor for the family so far.
And Gabby, why was Attorney General Barr on this trip?
It's a great question. Presumably because the president wants to use this opportunity to communicate his campaign message of law and order, and bringing the nation's attorney general with him is one way to accomplish that. Bill Barr did give remarks of his own during the visit to Kenosha, in which he said that this entire response to the shooting of Jacob Blake has been manipulated and overrun by radical anarchists. It was very much aligned with the rhetoric that you heard during the Republican convention last week from the Trump campaign and from the president himself, as he looks to contrast his approach to some of the riots, the looting, the protests that have not been peaceful, with the approach of Vice President Joe Biden.
Well, Ed, the Trump campaign said in a statement that President Trump was bringing a push for peace to Kenosha, and that Joe Biden's, quote, soft spot for rioters, end quote, is on full display. That's a reference to Joe Biden's speech yesterday, where he posed the question, do I look like a radical socialist with a soft spot for rioters? But Ed, as we watch events continue to develop out of Wisconsin, remind us how important that state is to both of their campaigns.
That's why 10 electoral votes. The state is a critical battleground. It is one of the closer states right now, among the most competitive battleground states across the country. And those 10 electoral votes could tip the scales in either direction for the vice president, for the president, depending on how election night, or once all election results are tabulated, sorts out. Remember, of course, it went narrowly for the president in 2016. Democrats would like to get it back. That was partly why they were planning on having their convention in the state this summer. That didn't happen, of course. Biden hasn't been to Wisconsin in, I believe, more than 600 days, as the Trump campaign tallies it. and there is pressure for him to perhaps show up and do that. But it is a critical spot. And not only Wisconsin, of course, but also the Trump campaign believes they can win Minnesota, and the Biden campaign is putting more resources into that state. Michigan looks to be headed back towards Democrats, but Democrats there remain skittish about the possibility that all this discussion of law and order could potentially tip the scales back in the direction of the president. And Pennsylvania, these kinds of industrial Rust Belt states that had traditionally voted Democrat that the president has put into play, remain the focus of both campaigns. And it's, you look in these closing 63 days at where these two candidates are going to put their time, put their money, put their advertising dollars. Wisconsin's certainly one of them. Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania to some extent. And let's see if they ever head again to the Southwest, to Arizona, places like that. It's a sign of where they think that they have a real chance of holding on. In the case of the president, we're taking it back in the case of Mr. Biden.
Well, last night, Gabby, we heard the president suggest that the 17-year-old who's been charged with killing 2 people at a protest in Wisconsin was acting in self-defense. This notion of law and order, Gabby, how strong is the Trump campaign's belief that a law and order message and strategy will ultimately mean victory this fall?
Well, right now, they feel like they've gone from being on defense for the majority of this summer against Joe Biden's campaign to being on offense as they lean into this law and order message. For the first time this week, we are hearing rumors from around the Biden campaign that he actually might travel to Wisconsin, as Ed mentioned, that he might get out on the campaign trail. He just gave a speech yesterday addressing some of the attacks that the president has lobbed against him related to the violent protests that have unfolded in cities like Portland and Kenosha and Seattle. So I do think that they, if you talk to Trump campaign advisors, officials who are working on the president's reelection, they say that they have never felt more confident than in this moment. And mostly the reason for that is because they have finally, in their view, found an attack line that sticks against Joe Biden after so many months of searching for something that would actually translate in polls, that would resonate with voters, and have an impact on bringing white working class individuals and other demographics back to the president, who had begun to gradually drift towards the Democratic nominee. They do feel as though this message resonates with those groups, and I anticipate that they will lean further into this message the closer we get to the election. I was just talking to a few sources close to the Trump campaign this morning about what the president is doing for his debate prep as he prepares for the first presidential debate against Joe Biden on September 29th. And one of the things they said is that he will get into the issues, and one of the issues they want to focus on is law and order and protecting and supporting law enforcement. So they really do plan to dig in their heels on these issues and use them as an attack line against Biden for the foreseeable future.
So, Ed, as we see the president get out and talk about this law and order message in various parts of the country, it's not just the president, of course, it's also Vice President Mike Pence, who has gone out on various trips. What is the internal debate on the Biden side about how to sort of match, if at all, if there's a debate going on about trying to get out and be seen in some of these places? We did see Joe Biden, as you said, give that speech in Pennsylvania yesterday. But at this point, being in the home stretch, how intense is that debate happening on the Biden side?
Well, we know it's going to happen. It's just a matter of when and where exactly he's headed. Tomorrow, he's now scheduled to give remarks and hold a meeting with educators in Wilmington, near his home, again with his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, to talk about reopening schools amid the pandemic. Because remember, the Biden campaign has remained much more focused on that as the president tries to change the subject of many Americans, or the minds of many Americans, and focus on law and order issues instead. So he'll address that tomorrow. What remains an open question is when or if he's going to Wisconsin. He hasn't ruled it out. He mentioned in a fundraiser, I believe it was last week, now I'm losing track of time, that he intends to hit the road after Labor Day, visiting places like Arizona, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and of course Pennsylvania, where he went yesterday. Probably some others as well. Our understanding is that it's likely to be much like the president, a day trip out and come back to Delaware each night. And try to make contact with people when you're there. And you'll see something similar to what he did in Pennsylvania yesterday. You go give a speech, you get a little tour, sit and do a virtual conversation with people somewhere else, make a quick stop to drop off pizza at a firehouse, and then go home. That pattern will repeat itself over the course of the next 60 or so days as he travels to these different states, but it's definitely in the works. Remember, we've heard Jacob Blake's family say, not really interested in meeting with the president, not really interested in meeting with Vice President Biden. Biden and Senator Harris called the Blake family and spoke with them shortly after Mr. Blake was shot. They said they had a nice conversation with him, but there's a belief and a sensitivity to the fact that all of this is a distraction to the community and can whip up emotions yet again in a way that isn't helpful necessarily to local leaders once the circus essentially leaves town. So we'll see if and when Biden goes to Wisconsin and where exactly he goes. Does he go to Kenosha? Does he go to Milwaukee? Does he go to some other part of the state to visit with supporters? We're eagerly awaiting that itinerary, but we do anticipate starting next week that he will begin making trips maybe once, twice a week to different places, much like the president's been doing. Remember, the vice president tonight is in Pennsylvania as well. President goes to North Carolina tomorrow. All of these states are the ones in play. North Carolina, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Michigan. Those are the places where these guys are going to be headed over the next few weeks.
Well, the New York Times also reports Biden is expected to have raised more than $300 million in August between his campaign and his shared committees with the Democratic Party. Put this into perspective for us. Just how big of a boost could that be to his campaign?
Oh, it's a huge sum. And look, we haven't been waved off that reporting ourselves, that when all is said and done, the Biden campaign and the various Democratic Party campaign committees that are the victory committees that are raising money in conjunction with the campaign on behalf of Democratic candidates across the country will have raised north of $300 million in the month of August. If you think about it, we know that about $48 million was raised in the 24 hours or so after Kamala Harris was named. We know they raised more than I believe it was more than $100 million the week of the convention. They've been bringing in some cases, according to some reports, double digits through online fundraising almost every day of the month. So it adds up, and it's going to hit more than $300 million. That'll benefit the Biden campaign. That'll benefit potentially Democratic congressional candidates across the country and the party overall as it tries to turn out voters, as it tries to pay for the text messaging systems, the other digital advertising and targeting that they will do across the country to try to convince people to turn out. And it'll help with advertising as well. The Trump campaign kind of sneers at this and says they're wasting money by spending advertising needlessly in certain ways. They're not spending as much right now over at the Trump team, but the Biden campaign continues to. And, at a time when you're not spending a lot on overhead, you're not flying people or the campaign and dozens of staffers every day to multiple stops. You don't necessarily have to rent as much office space. The lack of overhead means a lot more of that could potentially be spent on digital or in-person outreach, and we'll be very curious to see in the coming months as the spending reports come out to see exactly how that money was spent. But it's a huge boost, another sign of how cycle after cycle after cycle electioneering in this country, especially at the presidential level, gets more expensive, and this year much more creative in how they spend that money.
All right, Ed O'Keefe and Gabby Orr, thank you both very much.